Bleached blonde snickers sliced through 8-year-old Sophie's careful silence. Her father, 3 feet away, barks into his phone about market volatility. The waitress Margaret sees it all. The daisy-yellow dress, the trembling lip, the coming storm of regret this oblivious billionaire is about to face. "Hi there, sweetheart," she murmurs, sliding into the booth opposite Sophie. The girl's relief is palpable. "What if I told you that sometimes the most powerful people in the world are brought to their knees by the simplest act of kindness?" Margaret Chen had worked at Rosewood Diner for 37 years, her weathered hands steady as she poured coffee, and her smile genuine for every customer who walked through those glass doors. She'd seen politicians, celebrities, and business moguls come and go, treating each one the same as the construction workers who stopped by for breakfast. But on this particular Tuesday morning in October, she noticed something that would change everything. A little girl with Down syndrome sat alone in booth 7, tears streaming down her cheeks, while cruel laughter echoed from the table beside her. Margaret's heart clenched as she watched the child's father, a man in an expensive suit, apparently oblivious to his daughter's pain, his attention buried in his phone. What Margaret did next would shock a billionaire to his core. "Where are you watching from today?" Margaret had raised 4 children of her own and had seen every kind of heartbreak that could visit a family. Her youngest son, Danny, had been born with cerebral palsy, and she knew intimately the look of a child who felt different, who sensed the world's judgment before they even understood what it meant. As she approached booth 7 with her coffee pot, she caught fragments of the teenager's conversation from the next table, whispers about that weird kid, and snickering that made her blood simmer. The little girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with soft brown curls and the sweetest face Margaret had ever seen. She wore a yellow dress with small daisies, and her small hands were folded carefully in her lap as she tried to make herself invisible. Her father, meanwhile, was deep in what sounded like a heated business call, his voice sharp as he discussed quarterly projections and market volatility. Margaret recognized the type. Successful, driven, probably meaning well, but missing the forest for the trees. "Hi there, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, sliding into the booth across from the child. "I'm Margaret. What's your name?" The girl looked up with startled eyes, wiping her nose with a napkin. "I'm Sophie," she whispered. "Those boys are being mean to me." Margaret's heart ached as she glanced over at the teenagers, 3 boys around 16 who were clearly enjoying their cruelty. One of them made an exaggerated face, mocking Sophie's expressions, while his friends laughed. Without hesitation, Margaret stood up and walked to their table. "Boy," she said firmly but kindly, "I need you to stop what you're doing right now." The ringleader, a tall kid with bleached hair, smirked up at her. "We're not doing anything, lady. Just having breakfast." Margaret had dealt with bullies before. They came in all ages and tax brackets. "You're hurting a sweet little girl who's done nothing to you," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd raised teenagers and wasn't easily intimidated. "Now you can either show some kindness or you can find somewhere else to eat." The boy's expression shifted, perhaps seeing something in Margaret's eyes that reminded him of his own grandmother. "Whatever," he muttered, but the mocking stopped. Margaret returned to Sophie, who had been watching everything with wide, hopeful eyes. "Thank you," Sophie said quietly. "Nobody ever tells them to stop." Margaret felt her throat tighten. How many times had this precious child endured such cruelty while her father remained oblivious? As Margaret sat back down, she noticed the man. At the next booth, Sophie's father had finally ended his call and was looking around impatiently. He was younger than Margaret had expected, maybe 45, with graying temples and tired eyes that suggested success had come at a cost. "Sophie, we need to go," he said, already reaching for his wallet. "I have another meeting in 20 minutes. Sophie's face fell. "But Daddy, I haven't finished my pancakes." Margaret watched as the father glanced at his expensive watch, clearly torn between his schedule and his daughter's simple request. She'd seen this dance 1,000 times. Busy parents, well-meaning, but distracted, missing the small moments that mattered most to their children. What she couldn't have known was that this particular father, James Morrison, was one of the wealthiest men in the country, or that he was about to witness something that would shatter every assumption he'd made about his life. James Morrison checked his phone again, anxiety creeping up his spine. The merger with Continental Industries was hanging by a thread, and every minute he spent away from his office felt like money bleeding from his accounts. Sophie was taking forever with those pancakes, moving each bite around her plate like she was rearranging furniture. "Come on, princess," he said, forcing patience into his voice. "We really do need to hurry." Margaret had returned to serving other customers, but she kept glancing back at Sophie, who had barely eaten, despite claiming hunger earlier. There was something deeply familiar about the child's defeated posture, the way she seemed to shrink into herself when her father showed impatience. It reminded Margaret of her own Danny, who used to take twice as long as other children to finish simple tasks, not from stubbornness, but from the extra effort it took his body and mind to coordinate. "Excuse me," Margaret said, approaching James's table. "I don't mean to intrude, but I noticed your daughter seems upset. Those boys were bothering her earlier." James looked genuinely surprised. "What boys?" His eyes followed Margaret's gesture to the teenagers, who were now finishing their meal and preparing to leave. For the first time, James really looked at Sophie, not just a glance to check if she was ready to go, but actually saw her tear-stained cheeks and the way she was hunched over her plate. "Sophie, honey, what happened?" James asked, his business voice softening. Sophie looked up at her. "Father?" Then at Margaret, clearly torn between wanting to tell the truth and not wanting to cause trouble. "They were making faces at me," she said finally, saying, "I look funny and talk weird." James felt something cold settle in his stomach. How had he missed this? He'd been sitting 3 FT away from his daughter while she was being tormented, and he'd been completely oblivious. Margaret noticed the change in James's expression, the way his successful businessman mask cracked to reveal a father's raw pain. "Your daughter is beautiful and sweet," she told him quietly. "But children like Sophie need extra protection from the world's cruelty. They feel everything more deeply." James stared at this waitress, this stranger, who had done what he should have done, who had stood up for his child while he was discussing profit margins. The weight of realization hit James like a physical blow. How many times had Sophie endured this kind of treatment while he was distracted by work? How many moments of pain had he missed because he was always rushing to the next meeting, the next deal, the next mountain to climb? His throat felt tight as he watched Sophie finally take a real bite of her pancakes, seeming calmer now that the teenagers had left, and the kind waitress was nearby. But Margaret could see something else troubling the child, a deeper sadness that went beyond teenage bullying. Sophie kept glancing at her father with a mixture of love and resignation, as if she'd grown accustomed to being an afterthought in his busy life. Margaret's heart ached, recognizing that look. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. What would it take, Margaret wondered, to help this successful but distracted father understand what his daughter really needed from him? James Morrison sat in stunned silence as the full weight of his failures crashed down on him. He was a man who controlled billion-dollar corporations, who commanded respect in boardrooms across the globe. Yet he'd completely failed to protect his 8-year-old daughter from something as simple as teenage cruelty. The irony was devastating. He could shield his companies from market crashes and hostile takeovers, but he hadn't even noticed his child being emotionally brutalized, 3 feet away from him. "How often does this happen?" he asked Sophie, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie looked down at her plate, pushing a piece of pancake around with her fork. "A lot," she said quietly. "At school, at the playground, at restaurants, people stare and whisper." James felt physically sick. His daughter had been navigating a world of judgment and cruelty largely alone. While he congratulated himself on providing her with the best private schools and medical care money could buy, Margaret refilled James's coffee cup. Her movements gentle and unhurried, despite the breakfast rush building around them. She'd seen enough broken families to recognize a man coming to terms with his own blindness. "Mr. Morrison," she said. She'd overheard his name during one of his phone calls. "Your daughter is lucky to have you, but she needs more than financial security. She needs to know she's your priority." The simple truth of Margaret's words hit James like a sledgehammer. When was the last time he'd really spent time with Sophie? Not the hurried bedtime stories or distracted car rides to school, but actual focused time where she had his complete attention. He couldn't remember, and that realization made his chest ache with shame. His ex-wife, Jennifer, had tried to tell him this during their custody negotiations, but he dismissed her concerns as vindictive attacks on his parenting. "I worked so hard to give her everything," James said more to himself than to Margaret. "The best therapists, the best schools, anything she might need." Margaret nodded understandingly. "Material things are important," she said gently, "but what she needs most is to feel valued by her father. Children with special needs often think they're burdens. Sophie needs to know she's a joy, not a responsibility." At that moment, Sophie looked up from her pancakes with those trusting brown eyes. "Daddy, are you disappointed that I'm different?" The question pierced James's heart. How could his precious daughter, the light of his life, despite his terrible way of showing it, think such a thing? "Oh, sweetheart." "No," he said, reaching across to take her small hand. "You're perfect exactly as you are. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel otherwise." But even as he spoke the words, James knew they weren't enough to undo months of benign neglect. Sophie smiled, but it was the practiced smile of a child who'd learned not to expect too much from her father's attention. Margaret watched this exchange with a mixture of hope and concern. She could see the genuine love in James's eyes, but she also recognized the pattern of a workaholic parent who made promises in moments of crisis only to fall back into old habits. Once the immediate guilt faded, have you ever faced something like this in your own family? Let us know in the comments. The breakfast rush was picking up, but Margaret made a decision that would surprise even herself. Instead of moving on to other customers, she sat down beside Sophie. "You know what, honey? I think your daddy needs to learn something important about what makes little girls feel special. And I think I know just the way to teach him." Margaret's unexpected announcement hung in the air like a challenge. James Morrison, accustomed to being the one who made decisions in set terms, found himself at the mercy of a diner waitress who seemed to understand his daughter better than he did. "What did you have in mind, Ramans?" he asked, surprised by his own willingness to surrender control. "Well," Margaret said, settling more comfortably in the booth, "I've been working here for 37 years, and I've learned a few things about what really matters to children. Sophie, would you like to show your daddy what you've been drawing in that notebook you brought?" Sophie's eyes lit up with surprise and pleasure. James hadn't even noticed she'd brought anything with her. Another small failure that stung. Sophie carefully pulled out a worn notebook filled with colored pencil drawings. As she opened it, James saw page after page of remarkably detailed pictures. Their house with flowers in front, a dog they didn't have playing in a yard, and most poignantly, drawings of herself and James together, doing things they'd never actually done, flying kites, baking cookies, reading stories under a tree. Each drawing was signed with Sophie Morrison in careful, proud letters. "These are beautiful, Princess," James said, his voice thick with emotion. He realized he'd never asked Sophie about her art before, never taken time to see the world through her eyes. "This one here," he pointed to a drawing of them having a picnic. "When did you draw this?" Sophie looked down shilly. "I draw things I wish we could do together. Miss Jennifer at school says imagination is important." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Sophie has quite a talent. She's been showing me her drawings every time you come in here." James felt another stab of realization. His daughter had been regularly sharing her artwork with a virtual stranger because her own father never made time to look. The waitress had become more of a confidant to Sophie than he had. "You know what?" James said, making a decision that surprised even himself. "I'm canceling my meetings today." He pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. Margaret watched as this powerful businessman sent message after message, rescheduling appointments that were probably worth millions of dollars. Sophie stared at her father in amazement. She'd never seen him choose her over work before. "Are you sure, Daddy?" Sophie asked carefully, as if afraid to believe it might be true. "What about your important meeting?" James looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw past the Down syndrome to the bright, creative, loving person she was. "You're my most important meeting," he said, and for the first time in months, he meant it completely. Margaret smiled as she watched father and daughter plan an impromptu day together. James was asking Sophie what she'd like to do, listening to her answers with the same focused attention he usually reserved for corporate presentations. It was a small moment, but Margaret had seen enough families to know that small moments could change everything. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. As Margaret prepared to return to her other customers, Sophie tugged on her apron. "Thank you for being nice to me," the little girl said, "and for helping my daddy remember how to see me." Sometimes, Margaret thought, the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. 3 months later, Margaret was wiping down tables during the quiet afternoon lull when she heard the familiar chime of the diner's front door. She looked up to see James and Sophie Morrison walking in, both wearing matching smiles and paint-stained clothes. The transformation was remarkable. James looked years younger, his perpetual tension replaced by genuine contentment, while Sophie practically glowed with confidence and joy. "Margaret," Sophie called out, rushing over to give the waitress a tight hug. "Look what Daddy and I made." She proudly held up a canvas painted with bright swirls of blue and yellow, abstract, but clearly made with love and laughter. James followed more slowly, carrying what appeared to be his own artistic attempt, a slightly lopsided but charming landscape. "We've been taking art classes together," James explained, settling into their usual booth. "Sophie's been teaching me about colors and imagination. Turns out I have a lot to learn." Margaret poured their coffee and chocolate milk without being asked, marveling at how relaxed James seemed. Gone was the man who used to check his phone every 30 seconds and rush Sophie through meals. "The funny thing is," James continued, "I thought I'd lose everything by working less. But my companies are actually doing better. When you're present for the important moments, you make better decisions across the board." He reached over and squeezed Sophie's hand. "Plus, I discovered I have the most amazing daughter in the world. I just had to slow down enough to notice." Sophie beamed at her father's words, then turned to Margaret with excitement. "Daddy's coming to my school play next week, and we're getting a dog, and every Tuesday is our special art day." Margaret felt her heart swell with satisfaction. This was why she'd stayed at the diner all these years, not for the modest paycheck or the routine, but for moments like these when she could make a real difference in people's lives. "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully, "I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've learned that the most successful people aren't necessarily the ones with the most money or the biggest offices. They're the ones who know what truly matters and have the courage to prioritize it." James nodded, understanding completely. "A wise waitress once told me that Sophie needed to feel valued, not just provided for." Best business advice I ever received. As they prepared to leave, Sophie handed Margaret a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a drawing of the three of them in the diner, with Margaret wearing a cape like a superhero. At the bottom in Sophie's careful handwriting were the words, "Margaret the Kindness Angel." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she hugged the little girl who had taught her just as much as she taught them. James shook Margaret's hand warmly. "Thank you," he said simply. "You saved my relationship with my daughter. I can never repay that." Margaret smiled, thinking of all the families she'd watched struggle and heal over the decades. "Just keep being present for her," she said. "That's all any child really wants." As father and daughter walked out of the diner hand in hand, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've changed someone's life for the better. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the smallest acts of kindness, a willingness to speak up for a vulnerable child, to offer wisdom to a struggling parent, to remind busy people what truly matters in life. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovering that love, presence, and kindness are the greatest gifts we can offer each other.